And to date, there still has been no decision in his application to stay on humanitarian and compassionate grounds. And in the case of Jeremy Hintzman, who was the first person to make a legal attempt to stay in Canada, the courts have ruled against the government, saying that when you've considered people's application to stay on humanitarian and compassionate grounds, you have not considered closely enough people's beliefs, which are protected under international law, including religion, which in Jeremy's case, he had actually attempted to leave the military based on his faith, and that process was extremely messy and bungled and didn't work. But so you have, in addition to these court cases going on and the government's army of lawyers against a few diligent folks who are doing the legal stuff on our side, last summer the Canadian CIC, Immigration and Citizenship Canada. Issued an Operational Bulletin 202, which gave direction to their immigration officers to single out war resistor cases in the aspect of that they may not be criminally admissible to Canada. And this is part of what happens in immigration cases. They do look at whether people have committed crimes in the past that would make them unsuitable for our country. But this is a very unusual thing to make a blanket statement about a group of people and to issue a bulletin that says basically, send us all your cases, we're going over them with a fine-tooth comb for this group of people. These cases are still up in the air. In the case of Rodney, it's been about 18 months now, and while I'm grateful, and I'm sure that Rodney and his family are grateful that the government has honored the tradition of sanctuary and not busted into the church and forced him to leave, they're playing another kind of brutal game by not making a decision in his case and by just ignoring him and leaving him to sit. Twice, Parliament voted on recommendations from the Parliamentary Committee on Citizenship and Immigration. A motion came from that, and that's an all-party committee. Motions came forward basically saying the same kind of thing that the private members bill later on did, that the government has the ability and should work with us to create a provision to allow war resistors to stay. And in our minority government situation, both times those motions passed. And
I want to start by saying that I believe that Canada needs people of conscience. We've been well served by such people who have taken a stand on an important issue of principle, a stand for peace, a stand for truth, a stand for accountability in government. And wherever we have military forces, we want soldiers who do not check their conscience at the recruiting office door. We need people in the armed forces who act out of full conscience. It is clear that the vast majority of Canadians did not support the invasion of Iraq. Many of us believe that it was an illegal act of aggression, and Canada rightfully refused to participate in this so-called war. The government of the day made the right decision not to participate. It is now very clear that the United States and former President George Bush misled, some would even say lied, to not only the American people but to those in the rest of the world about the situation in Iraq prior to the invasion. They simply did not tell the truth about the presence of weapons of mass destruction. They lied that this fight was against Al-Qaeda and that it was a war on terrorism. There is no doubt that the Saddam Hussein regime had a horrendous human rights track record, but the invasion of Iraq had nothing to do with addressing those abuses or improving the lives of ordinary Iraqis. In fact, the situation is probably even worse today for those ordinary Iraqis. This war has been a terrible mistake. These war resistors are people who can make a positive contribution to Canada and who share key Canadian values. Values that taught them to fight hard for what they believe in and do what is right. Values that lead them to want to support a path of peace rather than war. Values that place life over death, and values that seek the best for the country and hold it to a higher standard. Canada made it possible for over 100,000 Vietnam war resistors to find a safe haven from militarism here. And over 50,000 of those folks remained in Canada. Canada did well by that migration. Canada did well by our decision to welcome those young men and women of conscience to our country. This is one way that Canada can be an agent for peace in the world. I believe Canadians strongly support such an action. There must be a special immigration program for conscientious objectors. We must ensure that people from countries that are unwilling to recognize conscientious objection find a welcome home here. Thousands of people in Canada have endorsed the declaration to create a special category for war resistors in the Immigration Act. From my perspective as a Member of Parliament, the House still has 2 motions on the register that maintain support for war resistors. There has not been a single piece of legislation retracting those motions. Our obligation today is to continue to work in our communities to raise awareness on this important issue, to make it an election issue should we find ourselves going to the polls as early as next month.
So there's still strong popular support for the case of war resistors. They still live in a legal limbo. And we're still searching for ways that that Canada can show the way that we have been welcoming to people in the past, that we can continue that legacy. And if anyone's ever watching the news anytime, anywhere these days, you know that that is becoming much more difficult. The things that we seem to identify as Canadian are being eroded, and this is one of those things. And in their case, there's people's lives that are hanging in the balance, and people who are living in limbo. And Jeff was making the distinction between folks who stay in the United States and fight and go to jail, and those who come to Canada. And people have said that, well, why didn't they stay and fight? And I believe, as Jeff does, that we all have choices, we all have a role to play, and I think this is something that we can fight this battle on many fronts. And one of them, I think it's important that Canadians are being challenged to support this position. And Jeff mentioned that the folks who have stayed and been incarcerated by the military, have had their lives destroyed. Well, I would argue that the war resistors have made an equally difficult choice, and their lives are, if not destroyed, completely in limbo, have left everything they know, culturally, and their families, and it's a really difficult choice for them as well.
You enter a contract based on certain assumptions. One of the assumptions was, for instance, in the Iraq War, that it was a legal war sanctioned by the world, via the United Nations. And when you find out that part of the contract, that assumption that was built into the basis for that contract, was not the case, what does that do to the contract?
And in terms of law, this is where he mentioned the Nuremburg Code. This is international law. And international law says that individuals are obliged to a higher law than their national law when they see that their national law is going against basic human rights. And so in that case, these soldiers are also making a claim underneath Nuremberg provisions to be following the higher law of the United States. The idea is represented in the Constitution again, to refuse to follow their government when it does something that is against the interests of the United States as a whole.
I would argue that in this case, when there's the broader global moral issue were all the facts that the political arm that put the bureaucracy into motion correct, you would have to, at this point, you would conclusively say, I mean, it's been admitted that they were not. So the political arm has put the bureaucracy, i.e. the government, the army, in motion under those assumptions that were false.
These soldiers that are deciding not to participate, whether they resist in the United States and go to jail or decide to flee and go to start a new life in Canada. The bottom line is it's a terribly, impossibly difficult situation. And to speak out inside the military, as you know, is not an easy thing to do. The military has discipline, it has a code of conduct, it has camaraderie, it's all these things that encourage the soldier to go along. It's part of what the military is all about. What I find one of the most valuable sort of online sources today for following issues of American military law especially is a site called Tom Dispatch, which you can find easily. Tom Englehart's the editor of this thing, and just recently, this week, he has a retired Air Force colonel, Storr is his name, I believe, talking about just this, the challenges that American soldiers face trying to speak out against the American policies of the last 10 years. It is a difficult thing to do.
We believe that under Nuremberg principles and the Geneva Conventions, the war resistors have a strong case as political refugees, and yet our meant to be arm's length board of our immigration and citizenship ministry will not allow discussion of international law that Canada has signed on to. Don't know what to do with that.
We've all recognized as humans that war is terrible for a long time, and we've spent the last, especially the last 60-some years creating international law to control warfare underneath the auspices of the United Nations, trying to correct the mistakes that failed between World War I and World War II with the League of Nations. The United States championed those laws. Canada championed those laws. The real tragedy here was what came in 2003 when the United States decided that it was going to essentially ignore and severely damage that entire edifice of international law, which was meant to control war, to make it so that wars would only be defensive and it would be clear who the good guys and the bad guys were and such things. Now the United States, from a legal perspective, is the bad guy. They broke international law. They had a war of aggression. And that is the basis of many of these soldiers' initial resistance to go to that war, and then the way the war was fought, building on that initial crime, led to places like the tragedies that have grown up and the war crimes that have been identified. And one of the things we've got here in Canada are veterans of that war who came here and pointed out things that were happening in Iraq, putting bait out for snipers to shoot children when they came to pick up the bait. That kind of illegal activities was voiced here in Canada by these war resistors when they came here saying, I was there, I did these things, I saw them happen, it shouldn't be done that way. When later that becomes national news stories, when the Washington Post reports about this baiting and sniper bait, that kind of stuff, this is where Canada, like was mentioned, can lead the way. We have a forum here to talk about upholding international law and living by the values that we say we live by. And so let's do it, Canada.